with running between committees, it's really hard to be here and to hear many of the questions and the testimony that you all gave. Sorry if this question had already been asked and if you'd all have given an input to this. But Dr. Haz, I know that you've been somewhat critical of the JCPOA. Your perspective is that it's too short term. And so I'm wondering, what should a deal look like?
I think it's important to be clear about what a deal could realistically include and what it could not. I think it could include longer-term limits, ideally open-ended limits. I don't see why Iran should have the right to get close to developing a nuclear weapon in 50 years or 75 years. So I would prefer open-ended efforts, but if not that, many decades. I think it should include ballistic missiles. I think it should be verifiable. I think it has to involve sanctions relief. And I think, though, that other aspects of Iranian behavior in the region should be dealt with other ways. I don't think it's realistic to build a quote-unquote grand bargain that would resolve all of our concerns with Iran. In my experience, all-or-nothing diplomacy tends to yield nothing.
Yeah, I appreciate that answer. And so to you and maybe to the rest of the panel, I'm wondering, why would Iran, after we unilaterally left the JCPOA, assassinated Soleimani, destroyed their economy with our sanctions, threatened to bomb their cultural sites, why would they be willing to enter into a better deal with us at this moment?
The reason they might is, as you know, governing is about choices. The economic sanctions are having a significant toll. They could conceivably threaten the viability of the government and the revolution. So I would think that if Iran is offered significant sanctions relief, that might be something that they would countenance. They say they don't want nuclear weapons. So it ought not to change that. So I think the question is, if we can present them with a choice, I wouldn't rule out one other thing. I think we probably would need to have it voted on by the Congress. They would need to know that the next deal is not something that this or any president could unilaterally overturn. I would think they would want to have the confidence that it was truly embedded in the policy of the United States.
Thank you, Congresswoman. I guess from my perspective, I continue to hope that there is an opportunity for negotiations and diplomacy, and I think we do need to invest in that. And I, have indicated that that's one of my recommendations moving forward. I think it is very unlikely that we're going to see the Trump administration capable of bringing the Iranians to the table and negotiating a deal like that. I think that's a reality, and unfortunate as that is. Thank you.
Mr. Bradley, did you have anything to add?
I'm a little more optimistic than my good friend Avril Haines is, and I think Richard Haass said it very well, and I subscribe to his comments.
Mm-hmm. Well, I appreciate your insights, and it's, I think, quite fascinating to hear that you all think critical sanctions relief package would be on the table for Iran if it was to re-engage, more significant than that was part of the JCPOA. I'm sure that's excellent. And it seems as if there are opportunities to negotiate. So I hope that cooler heads prevail and that we deploy diplomacy and look at using many of the tools that we have in our toolbox. Because what is happening right now in the ways that things have escalated is not going to make us safer, and it's not going to alleviate the economic burdens that the civilians of Iran are facing at the moment. Thank you, and I yield back.
Thank you. Mrs. Wagner.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, over here. 2 weeks ago, President Trump ended Qasem Soleimani's brutal reign of terror that killed and maimed countless Americans and coalition forces and threatened many, many more to come. I urge all Americans to unite behind the president's defensive decision to strike one of the world's most powerful terrorists who is organizing attacks against Americans in Iraq, in defiance, I might add, of UN Security Council Resolution 2231. He shouldn't have even been in Iraq, shouldn't have been in Beirut, shouldn't have been in Damascus. For far too long, Tehran has been permitted to act with impunity against U.S. allies' interests and its personnel. I applaud the president for making our red lines clear to the Iranian regime that attacking Americans is never acceptable, and when American lives hang in the balance, Iran will be held to account for its actions. The Middle East is a safer place when the United States is clear and consistent in its intentions. Mr. Hadley, to what degree are Iran's proxies dependent on Tehran for financial, material, and technical assistance? And how successful has the United States been in preventing Iran from providing significant support to these proxy groups?
I'm not privy to intelligence anymore and haven't been for a long time on these subjects. My understanding is that the economic pressure that Iran is now under has resulted in some diminishment of the resources that are available to these groups. I think, for example, Nasrallah, who's head of Hezbollah, has actually complained that he doesn't have enough resources for his activities. So I think it is having effect based on what I've read in public sources, but I don't have the kind of intelligence sources available to me that would allow me to give you a better answer to that question.
Well, I thank you. They've clearly gone through the $150 billion plus that were sent over by the Obama administration, strapped to pallets to be used for these proxies to kill people around the globe, including our American allies and assets. After the Iranian regime admitted that it shot down Ukrainian International Airlines Flight 752, tragically killing 176 passengers, and I know it's been discussed here at length, protests did erupt across the country. Mr. Hadley, how are these protests connected, do you think, to the pro-democracy, pro-economic reform demonstrations of the last few years? And do you think that this public outrage will constrain Iran's foreign policy? Can it be constrained?
It's been interesting to see how many demonstrations there have been in the last 2 years of people demanding accountability from their governments, ending of corruption, less sectarianism, governments that actually perform. You've seen it in Algeria, you've seen it in Sudan, you've seen it in Lebanon, you've seen it in Iraq, you've seen it in Iran, a lot of other places in the Middle East. This is a positive thing, and I think it is one of the sources of leverage on the Iranian regime that may make them willing to come to the table and negotiate an outcome, because they put down the demonstrations in October and November only by a fairly brutal use of force. And I think they are worried that the additional sanctions will kindle a return to those kinds of demonstrations that could threaten the regime, and is a threat to the regime, as Richard Haas said, that might bring them to the table.
I absolutely agree, and that's why I also share your bullishness on the opportunity that we have at this moment of time to bring Iran to the table for further negotiations, more now than ever. And these protests and the public outrage, I think, could really have an effect as we go forward in foreign policy and such. So there are reports that indicate that Iran has worked to reduce internet connectivity near universities, hotspots, limiting the impact of these protests. How vulnerable is the regime to information operations, and how should the U.S. be using information to target the regime's weaknesses and empower this change? Mr. Hadley?
Well, they have cut off the internet to keep demonstrators from organizing as a part of their suppression of public demonstrations, clearly. You know, our best information operation has always been truth and trying to get it to the people in these closed societies, because what is really the toxic element for them is actually truth about what's happening in the world. And I think we have not done as good a job as we should in getting truth available to people in these totalitarian or authoritarian societies.
I agree. My time has expired. I shall yield back. But here is to truth and the Iranian people.